Welcome to another one of our sessions. Today we're going to cover a little bit of history of wine, a little bit of terroir, a little bit of Burgundy, just kind of to get you in the groove of things. As I said previously, my aim, my goal, my way of training is not to get you to study, to read loads of books, although if you're interested, it's more than appreciated. But the idea behind it is to get you to understand things and understand why things are happening the way they are and how the world of wine developed. Basically, just give you a better understanding of things. So we're going to start off with a bit of a recap. So I need a volunteer that's going to walk me through what we talked about the vineyard all throughout the harvest. So basically, I want to know about basically how we get there. So who's going to volunteer? Anyone?
So many people.
All right, Marco, you're
Hey, we are. I knew it.
Next time, shut up and you'll be fine.
Hey, we are. Exactly. That's my only issue. So last time we spoke about the wine growing, so the process. We talk about the 3 different processes that you can have. Or you can have the organic one, where you don't use any chemical or pesticides. We talk about the biodynamic one. It is quite similar to the organic one, but you produce your own fertilizer.
What's it called? That fertilizer? Remember the word we used?
Can't remember the word.
Compost.
Exactly. How long does it take to make a good compost?
About 3 years.
Very good. What about, so we were talking about biodynamics quite a bit last time. So what's the deal with that calendar thing?
You follow the moon, because you work on the 4 elements of the vineyard. There is the roots, the leaves, the fruits, and I can't remember what the other one was before. Flower. Thank you.
All right. So why are we following that calendar?
Because we when we follow the moon, is follow we follow the reed of the plant. Is even a mistake. So the reed is like the nectar of the plant. So it's a way of you can protect the plants. Otherwise, if you're cutting the leaves or you're cutting the fruits in a different way, in the wrong time, you leave the plants to the open air. So you damage the old plant, where the reed will protect it.
All right. Did anybody understand what he was talking about?
I guess.
Anyone? Okay. Good in general, but you just try to gather your words a little bit better. Try to be a little bit more fluent, so we feel like you know what you're talking about. Otherwise, if you're gonna get to a guest and try to explain biodynamics this way, they're just gonna walk out, mate.
Okay.
So just to recap quickly from my end. So what we were talking about last week. So first we were talking about the climate and how it affects things. So just a quick one. Cool climate produces what kind of wines? High in what, low in what?
High in sugar and so high in alcohol. The
cool
warm
climate.
one.
Cool climate.
A bit lighter and less sugar.
Low alcohol.
And what
light
is it?
and fresh.
Yes, so high in acidity, low in alcohol. And warm climate?
High in alcohol, high in sugar.
And low in
acidity.
Exactly.
Lowest.
So that's the first thing to know. So yes, we were talking about the farming practices as well. And we were talking on Thursday a little bit about winemaking processes. So who can tell me what is the name of the process that converts bad, sharp acids to softer acids?
Fermentation.
There we go, all together, nice. Yes, malolactic fermentation. So the clue is in the name. Malo meaning bad, lactic meaning milky, creamy. What about oak? What kind of flavors does oak impart in wine?
Vanilla,
Yeah.
smoky,
Sorry, which one?
smoky, a smoky flavor.
Where does the smokiness come from?
Because they burn the barrel.
From the burn, yeah.
Yeah, so they're charring, not burning, charring.
Yeah.
Charring,
In them,
yes,
there
sir.
will be no more. Okay, and why do we put things in oak?
To reduce the tanning.
Okay, and why does that happen?
We allow the oxygen.
The oxygen.
Exactly. So we're basically trying to age the wine quicker and get it ready to be drunk a little bit quicker. Okay. All right. So a bit is still in there from last week, which is good. So we'll keep trying to build on this. And like I said, I'm preparing some sort of tests or quizzes or whatever, just to not to test you out. I don't need you to pass or whatever, but it's more for you to reinforce the knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to make them in a way that you're going to have 4 answers and you're going to need to choose the right one. So that's the best way kind of remembering things. Okay, so let's get started with today's topic. So we are starting with history of wine. So the first thing you need to understand about wine and its historic origins is that the grapevine is actually a vine. It is a wild thing. So it used to grow in forests, and foragers, Neanderthals, and the tribes that lived in those days, they were picking the grapes in the forest. So they were basically edible berries, and they weren't making wine for a very, very long time. But that's how it started. Once they learned that these vines can actually be cultivated, they started planting them, and this was when the age of the agriculturism started, when the nomadic tribes have stopped moving around and they started to settle. So they started to grow grape primarily because water wasn't that readily available. Even though people tried to move next to creeks and rivers, some of them did. They needed a way to have some beverage, to have some drinks. And wine was, or grape juice at that time, was actually a very, very good way to survive. The actual history of wine, as you may have heard, has started in Georgia and Armenia. You guys heard of this story before? Anyone? Bueller?
Couldn't hear you. What did you say?
So, the documented stories are that the first remnants of winemaking have been found in Georgia and Armenia. And this was supposed to be about 6,000 years ago. So about 4,000 BC. Now, this has been the story for a very long time, although recently it's been disputed, and we'll cover this a little bit later. But yes, they were the first people that were making wine. Obviously, the way it happened was by mistake. So as you can imagine, somebody was harvesting more than somebody was greedy, and when they were picking the grapes for their family, they picked more than they should. So they couldn't eat it all, and it ended up staying in a bucket, in a barrel, or in an amphora. Guys, can you turn off the mic if you're gonna chat around? So those grapes were stuck in this barrel, and they naturally started fermenting. So people originally thought they were going bad, so they were throwing them away. But then one guy was, I don't know, maybe went on holiday in Mexico or whatever, but came back and found that it didn't go bad. It actually fermented fully, and it became a really, really good drink. So that's how wine started. Now, the first winemaking, the first winery is this one in the picture. This is the oldest winery that we found. This is called the Areni 1. And inside of those caves in the middle, I don't know, you guys see this. So inside of those caves is where the first winery was kind of set, and this is in Armenia. This is what we know. Now, as I said, this has been disputed, and it's been found that the Chinese have actually been making wine since 7,000 BC. Another reason why we don't know about this is because nobody cares about China, right? No, but the Chinese later moved on to other alcoholic drinks. They moved on to beer and sakes and basically rice wine and things like that. So wine was never such a huge thing, even though they were the first people to kind of make it. The other reason why we didn't know about this is because China was separated from the rest of the world by the mountains, so not a lot of people actually made their way there. You know, in sort of modern history, Marco Polo was the guy that was the first rest of the worldian that moved across and discovered that region all anew. So basically, a lot of history went missing. Okay, now a little bit further into modern times, when wine stopped being just a beverage, but it started becoming a cultural importance as well. And this happened in Greece, in ancient Greeks. So the Greeks started realizing then that wine is not just something to quench your thirst, but it can actually be a pretty fun thing. It makes you do things you wouldn't normally do, which I'm sure we all know. So it became part of the culture. They actually even had problems with alcoholism at the time, which was the first documented cases came from there. The Greeks obviously were quite a big empire, but were eventually overrun by the Romans, and the Romans were then responsible for kind of spreading out the wine even further, and they were the first people to commercially start producing wine. So they weren't only, so before the Greeks were doing it, everybody had a vineyard at home or whatever, and they were just drinking for fun. And the Romans actually started trading with it, and they started making it into commodity. So the Romans were, like I said, they inherited the alcoholic problem from the Greeks. So they were actually famous for banning wine plantings for a while because the alcoholism went too far. So they had a law that prevented you from planting any new vineyards, specifically in Sicily and Campania. But anyway, that never took off. People still did it because obviously they didn't have drones and Facebook and things like that to check up on this. So yeah, they eventually removed that law and they went back to normal. Okay, so after that we moved to kind of the dark times, as we call them. After the Roman Empire, the other Romans took over, and that was the Roman Catholic Church. As you know from history, wine is a big thing in church, not just in Roman Catholicism, in Judaism as well, and so on. It is part of the Mass. It's what's it called, the blood of Christ, right? So it's the blood of Christ. So it was very important for them to have access to it. So what they did is because they were so strong and they kept on growing and growing and growing, they started owning all of the vineyards. They started taking them from the farmers, taking them from everybody, and just keeping them to themselves because they needed a steady supply of wine. Now this is all fun and well. Obviously that was a problem for the farmers, but in terms of wine, that was actually the best thing that could have happened to it. The reason for that are the monks. So I always say this story. So we know about the Greeks, we know about the Armenians, the Georgians, the Chinese, all of these people that have been making wine for much, much longer than, for example, the French and the Italians. But why do we only drink French and Italian wines? Why are these so important? So the reason are these monks. So it was the Benedictine monks, so these guys drank over there, and the Cistercian monks mainly. So these were the two largest orders that were involved in this. And the reason for that is very simple. I'm from Slovenia. We've been making wines for over 2,000 years, but we don't have nearly as much reputation or a name for ourselves as some of these other guys. And the reason for that is because we were dumb. And a lot of people were dumb. People didn't know how to read. People didn't know how to write. The average life expectancy was very, very low. So what happened was, for example, imagine myself. I'm 20 years old. My dad is 40 years old. I just started to learn the ropes in the vineyards, in the farms. So I do one vintage, let's say, with my dad. I try to learn as much as I can from him, and then he dies because he's 40, and that's a very, very old age. So what happened is, because he didn't know how to read, he didn't know how to write, he didn't pass me any information. So now I'm 20 years old. I have only one vintage of experience, and I need to learn everything on my own. So I do this over 2 years. I finally perfected it. I finally become great at it. my kid starts to take over and I die because I'm 40. And the kid has to start all over again. So this was it's like a Sisyphus work or job or whatever it's called, Sisyphus rock. So it's a never-ending tale, and there was no improvement. Now the difference is with the Benedictines and the Cistercian monks is that they were smart, they were intelligent, they were well-read, they were educated, they knew how to read, they knew how to write, and most importantly, they had all the time in the world. If you imagine a monk lives in a monastery, there's no sex to think about. All he had to think about was how he's gonna plant something in his garden or his vineyard and how he's gonna pray. That's pretty much all they've done. And obviously because they were, like I said, smart and intelligent and well-read, they were writing everything down. So they started learning how to improve things, and kept records. And the more they did this, the better the winemaking processes happened, and so on and so forth. So we ended up inheriting a lot of their practices, and some of them we still use today. One of the most famous Benedictine monks was Dom Perignon. I'm sure you've heard of this guy.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody know what Dom Perignon is famous for?
Champagne.
Yeah. Does anybody know what specifically in Champagne? What is his?
Second fermentation.
Nope.
Oh, I failed.
Yes, that, and it's not just your fault, but everybody thinks that he's the guy responsible for second fermentation, which is not true. That was actually Madame Veuve Clicquot that perfected it. He is accredited to actually finding a way of making white wine out of red grapes. So he's the reason why we were able to make Champagne white from Pinot Noir. That was quite an important contribution, and it's still used today. The same technique is did. Basically, it was kind of a cold maceration type of thing. So that's what he's accredited to. But yes, a lot of people think that he invented second fermentation. That's not true. All right. Okay, so coming back to the Benedictines, and this is going to kind of relate to Burgundy that we're going to cover a little bit more in depth on Thursday. But basically, so not only did they improve on their techniques and everything, they also improved on their understanding of terroir. And what is terroir? So terroir is a French word that we constantly use in terms of explaining what makes a particular wine taste like a particular wine. This is kind of the pinnacle. This is what we want from wine. We want to taste the wine, and we want to know exactly where it comes from. The reason for that is a combination of factors. So terroir basically means a small area that is affected by its particular soil type, particular climate, microclimate that is, and obviously the person working it as well makes a big difference. So as they started to discover this terroir, they noticed that vineyards taste different one to another. They were the first ones to coin the term. And they realized that two vineyards touching each other tasted completely differently. And that was the reason, because there was one corridor of air, of wind just running through there. And slightly different composition of soil made the wines just a different, different culture of yeast, things like that.
It's very noisy. I cannot hear you.
I hear you.
I cannot hear you either.
Somebody's trying to shave or something. Just sitting next to the street. All right, that's better. Hold on, who's this? I'm gonna shut you off. That's an iPhone here. I'm gonna mute you, whoever you are. Okay. So yes, so they discovered that all of these vineyards kind of started tasting differently, and they figured out which vineyards make the best wines, which vineyards make the worst wines, and so on and so forth. They were the first people that started to properly write appellations. Now, this makes Burgundy very complex, because obviously Benedictines and Cistercians were mainly based in Burgundy and in Germany and so on, even though they were in Bordeaux as well, but their Burgundian work is where it all kind of began. So I've got a little map here Like, seriously, what are you doing? Who is this loud person? It's very loud.
I think he's having a shower while listening to you.
Yeah. Thank you. I must be very entertaining. Okay. So anyway, I've got a little map here, which you can look at home as well. Where are you? It's called the Berg map. Okay, and this will help you understand, well, not help you understand Burgundy, but help you understand why terroir is so important. You see all of these little dots here on the map?
I cannot see
I
anything.
don't think.
Just gray.
Okay. Please move this window away from the shared application. Why? Hold on.
Maybe we should open by ourselves.
You can as well, but I will make it happen. You see it now?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool, yeah.
Figured it out. Genius. Okay, so this is Burgundy, right? So this all the way to Macon, which is down here. So I know this looks quite big, but this is actually only about 40 kilometers. And inside of these 40 kilometers, only these bits are actually classified as Burgundy. So nothing around there. So it's a very, very, very tiny region, but it produces probably some of the most expensive wines in the world. And the reason for that is this terroir that I've been talking about. So when they realized how wine tastes differently, they started designating these tiny vineyards. And as you can see on these pictures, these are very, very tiny vineyards. The white lines that you see in between, these are streets, these are roads. And they were put there because they separated two plots. There's different soil on this plot than it is on this plot. There's a different microclimate here, and the wines are, like I said, very, very different. Now, this made Burgundy, like I said, very, very complicated to learn, and marketing-wise, this was a complete failure. So they weren't actually, for a long time, selling their wines very, very well, which was fine because they were giving most of the wines to the church and the emperors and so on. Anyway, but in the long run, this is what benefited them. So the other problem that Burgundy had was the Napoleonic law. Do we have any French people here? Anyone French? No? Okay, you still have this in France, but Napoleon introduced a law where regardless if you had a will, you had to give each of your descendants an equal amount. So each of your kids had to have exactly the same amount of inheritance. What that meant was, I owned a vineyard of 1 hectare. I had 4 kids. I died. Now each of the kids has a quarter of a hectare. Okay, so my 1 vineyard got broken down into 4 bits. Now some people chose to farm them together and still be a family and like each other and so on and so forth, but a lot of people didn't. So going forward from that, second generation, my kids each had 2 kids. So their quarter of a vineyard became 1/8 of a vineyard, and so on and so forth. So this ended up breaking down Burgundy even further. So, and this is a great example on this map. Let me see, I think if we go to, yeah, Peugeot, that's gonna be best. So this is Clos Vougeot, one of the Grand Crus in Burgundy. And you can see, so these are all the producers. So this guy owns this plot of land. This guy owns this plot of land. Look how many people. Some people, look, they only owe a row or 2 rows. So this makes Burgundy incredibly complex, incredibly difficult to understand. And we'll talk more about Burgundy on Thursday, and we'll talk about the crus and what they mean and so forth. But just to give you an idea, so while this whole plot, you see, is divided into, so there's a half here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So 1 plot divided into another 17 that tastes completely differently. And on top of that, all of these 17 have countless owners, which obviously have their own approach to winemaking, their own approach to wine growing. So they make the wines taste even more differently. So yes, Burgundy, incredibly difficult to understand, but very fun to discover, and some incredible wines that are coming from here. Okay, I won't touch more on Burgundy because otherwise we can be here until next year. But feel free to discover. So you've got this map, bergmap.com. Have a look through just to give you an idea. And then on Thursday, like I said, we're gonna go a little bit deeper. All right, so let's go to the rest of the world and how history progressed there. So the one thing that might surprise you is Mexico. So it's not just on my picture behind me. Mexico was actually one of the largest wine growers on the planet. So the grapes were brought over by the Spanish, obviously, as it was their colony. And they brought it over again for the same reason as most of Europe, because of the church. Church needed wine so they could do their masses, and obviously Spanish tried to spread the religion throughout the Americas. So Mexico became one of the largest producers. So how come we don't hear about Mexico today? The reason for that is very simple. They were so big that they started threatening the Spanish production of wine, and the King of Spain banned them from making wine ever again. Oh. So pretty sucky situation for the Mexicans. Not that they were very happy to work anyway, but it was a very good thing for them to have it. Now, Mexico's wine is coming back a little bit, and hopefully they will get a little bit of a resurgence. But yeah, unfortunately, they're not as important in the world of wine as they used to be. Okay, the other New World countries that were quite important were the South Africans. So South Africans were one of the first New World countries that seriously took on wine. And they were basically selling their wines to other New World countries, such as Australia, New Zealand even, and they were selling it to the emperors and the kings in Europe. The reason for that was because they were cheaper. Even then, they were cheaper than Europe. The other reason, of course, was because they were a colony, an English colony. So obviously, they didn't have a choice other than to export things. Australians started blending wine in about 19th century or so, but most of the time it was for their local consumption. And then in the late 1990s, they started producing, 1980s actually, they started producing a lot of mass cheaper wine that we kind of know today. Obviously, they had a very high quality range as well, but nobody really knows about that, unfortunately. But yeah, if you do get a chance, spend some money on Australian wine, some really good stuff there. New Zealanders, similar, they were just drinking their own stuff. They had local consumption, and then in the 90s with the Sauvignon Blanc, they kind of brought it out. Now back to Europe, there was one very important thing that happened in 1855. So we're gonna touch more on this when we talk about Bordeaux next week. But just to give you an understanding, you might hear of this quite often. So in 1855, Bordeaux were smarter than the Burgundians. So Burgundians were thinking about, well, smarter is a relative word. Burgundians were thinking about how to make the best wines, how to showcase terroir the best, whereas the Bordeaux guys were thinking, how are we going to make the most money? And Bordeaux was the biggest port for England in terms of all European imports. So it started to be a very commercially successful town. Now, sorry to all the English people listening to, this is going to be a little bit rough, but it's actually quite true. The English people are not very educated. They're, well, educated, by the way, very smart. They like to think they are, however, they're not. And the French knew this and they tried to exploit this. And they did this by introducing this classification in Bordeaux. So the English would never understand Burgundy. Not that we can, but nobody can really understand Burgundy. Bordeaux tried to simplify this process. And what they did is they drew up a collection of all of the best chateaux, all of the best vineyards that they knew of. And they said, okay, let's classify these. Let's tell people how much they should be spending on these wine. And they classified them in 5 gros, or 5 Grand Crus, with the number 1 being the best, number 5 being the worst, but still very, very good. So the way they classify them was basically based on price. So how much somebody was paying at that time for a bottle of their wine, that meant you belong in the first class. So we ended up with originally having 4 Premier Grand Crus, so first gross, 9 second, 10 second gross, and so on. And these classifications, they are still in play today. So even today, you will hear of first growth wines, and they are the same as they were in 1855. So a very important classification. It put Bordeaux on the map, and their wines sold immensely because basically the 5 different classes allowed people to classify themselves. So if you were a rich lord, you could afford the first growth, and you would tell everybody you drink first growth. If you were kind of second rate, but still very, very impressive, you would drink second growths, and so on and so forth. So it's basically a status thing as well. And like I said, the Bordeaux were very smart commercially about this, so they really milk this. Now, the other reason why this is important is as well because it kind of gave ideas to other countries. So all of the other countries started thinking of some sort of classifications where they would be able to get people to understand their wines better. So appellation systems became more of a thing. That's why we know of, let's say, Chianti in Italy. We know that the wines there come from mainly Sangiovese. When we talk about Olos, we know that the grapes come from the Biolo. And that's the reason because they use these appellations. They try to make it easier for people to understand. New World was a little bit trickier because they were so late to the party. They didn't really have regional appellations. But what they did is they started putting names of grapes on the bottles, again, in the interest of consumers, so the consumers found it easier to understand. One other thing that was quite interesting in wine was the 1976 Judgement of Paris. Does anybody know what this is? Has anybody heard of this before? Anyone? Not really?
Yes.
Okay, yes? Tell us, what is it?
It was a meeting in Paris. It was comparing Bordeaux wines and Napa Valley wines, where Napa Valley won against the best producers of Bordeaux. It was a blind tasting.
Yes, very good. It wasn't just Bordeaux and Napa, it was France versus Napa, because in the whites they had Chardonnays as well. So the Americans were surprising winners. They both won in white and in red. Chateau Montelena, a winery that still exists today, won in whites. And what's it called? Stag's Leap Winery won with the reds. So the point of this Judgment of Paris was that an English guy, Stephen Spurrier, wanted to show he didn't like the French very much. He didn't like that they were very pompous and that everybody just drank French wine and they ignored the Italian, the Spanish, and especially the New World wines. So he did a blind tasting. He invited all of the top brass in French wine. So there were like the president of the appellations. There was the top winemakers from Burgundy and Bordeaux, and they were all tasting these wines completely blind. So they didn't know what they were drinking. And yes, like I said, the Americans and they ended up winning. So this was a huge thing for the American market, but not only the American market, because this kind of opened up the eyes for other countries as well. So people started drinking other grapes. Italians benefited a lot from this. Spanish benefited a lot from this as well. So quite an important thing. Now, there are legends that this was all bullshit, that it didn't really happen, or it was a little bit faked, but it doesn't matter because the result is there, and the result is what ultimately we wanted and Stephen Spurrier at the time wanted. All right. Last thing, modern day. So what's happening these days? A lot. Well, we're coming back a lot to history. So that's why we spent quite a bit of time last week talking about organics and biodynamics, because this is basically a return to the good old days where the wines were kind of self-sufficient and so on. So there's a lot of approaches going into that way. On the other hand, we've got technology that helps us kind of do things better. So for example, 20 years ago, if you had a massive vineyard and you wanted to spray it, you had to use a helicopter or a plane, which was not very good for the environment. Now you use a drone, and drone is less disturbing to the environment. It doesn't disturb the birds and everything as much because it doesn't rotate the air as much. Obviously, if it runs on electricity again, so theoretically it's better for the environment. So a lot of these things are kind of joining together the old and the new, and we are kind of seeing the best in the world of wines these days. All right. One last thing I want to cover, if you see the picture in the background over there, so that is the picture of the oldest vine that still produces wine. It is called Jamatoka, and this is actually, I'm very proud of this, Slovenian. It's been growing since the 17th century, and it still produces about 30 to 40 kilos of grapes every year. So it's a 350-year-old wine, which is pretty impressive. All right. So sorry, today was a little bit more boring, but history tends to be a little bit like this. But yeah, this is it for me. So I'm happy to answer more questions now if you have any, or explain more on certain things. So I'll stay here for another few minutes. If not, feel free to bugger off, and I'll see you on Thursday. All right.
I have none.
Bugger off then. Oh, by the way, in the group chat, you've got the PDF of today, just to give you, if you want to know.
There's a group chat.
You need to click on, like, at the bottom when you got share screen and pause and stuff like that, you got chat. So it's just the PDF of basically this. It's not much information, like I said. It's more important for you to listen, but just to kind of get your brain back to it, so you remember a little bit better.
I cannot see the document. Can you explain it where it is?
So if you open the group chat, so if you click on chat at the bottom, see it? Let me.
I don't have anything in the bottom.
Yeah, you didn't send anything.
Do you? Wait.
There are 3 dots that says more. On that you press start, and then something must be posted.
Yeah, but for me it's blank.
Maybe,
I have more.
Maybe because
When I open chat, is nothing.
I just put a message.
Yes, it's supposed to be there. Okay, let me send it
Yeah.
again, because maybe some of you joined later, and that's why it disappeared. So I'm just posting it again. No. You see it now?
Yes.
I can't see it still.
No, I can't.
I can't see it.
No.
I think you need to send it again because
No,
I just did.
he sent from Lenart to everyone, so you should see it in a matter of seconds.
One new message. I don't see anything.
No,
No, it's me. I don't see anything.
Okay.
No, me
I can
neither.
probably send it directly to you, I think. So Miri, let me see.
Oh, sure, nice one is different. Okay.
No, I can't. I can only send it to everyone.
Can you show me?
It might be different, yeah. So it might be just, yeah, because it's a file, obviously, it's probably you're gonna see it on a computer. So if you, so how are you gonna
But
do?
I'm on an iPad. So
Yeah, still probably.
I'm on laptop. I can't see it.
You can't see it on a laptop either?
No.
I can.
I can see it in the laptop.
I'm on the laptop and I can see it.
So why do some people see it, why don't?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
That's weird.
Did you put to everyone or you put? Oh yeah, put to
Yeah.
everyone.
I put to everyone, yeah. Okay, I'll
Yeah.
figure it out. I'm setting up a little site anyway, where all of these details are going to be. So I'll give you the access on Thursday, and then you have all of it. And then you'll have the tests as well, the exams. Okay.
Okay.
But Lenart, question. We
Yeah.
talk about the Bordeaux on 1855, introducing the classification, but it'd be interested only in Bordeaux, or and then Burgundy follow after, or Burgundy came before, or?
So the way this classification is done is made for only left bank Bordeaux. Burgundy has a very different classification, not based on chateaus, not based on the producer, but based on the vineyard, which is kind of what I hinted at earlier. But like I said, we'll cover more of this in detail on Thursday. It's a very big subject. So yeah, I'd really, let's cover that on Thursday.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
Theoretically, though, Burgundy was first. Well, the first people that wrote appellations were the Romans in Italy. So they had a vineyard called what's it called? Something in Campania. I can't remember right now. They were the first people that found wines that come from a particular region that were better than others, and they also were one of the first people to realize that the wine from the middle of the slope was better than the one from the bottom of the slope. So again, maybe relates a little bit more to what we're going to talk about on Thursday. I don't want to delve too deep, but yeah, very different types of appellations.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All appellations in general tend to be very different. Like, so in Europe, generally, an appellation will give you an area. It will give you particular laws, so what you can do, what you can't do. It will tell you which grapes belong there or don't belong there or are allowed there. Whereas, for example, in New World, Americans have AVAs, which are American Viticultural Areas, and they basically are just areas. They don't really tell you what to do or what not to do. You're allowed to pretty do whatever you want, but it just tells you that it comes from that particular tiny area. So a different approach. Everybody has a different one.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
All right. Anyone
Thank
else?
you. See you Thursday.
Okay. See you Thursday, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
See you later.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you.